before I get started, our first class, I just actually someone commented on the channel and pointed us out, and they were correct. So I promised them I'd address it in our next class. Our first class, when I was talking about the difference between valid and sound, I actually got them backwards, which is super embarrassing. But a valid argument is one where the conclusion logically must be true if the premises are true. So a valid argument is one where the conclusion follows logically from the premises. A sound argument is one that is both valid and has true premises. So valid is like the logical structure requires a conclusion. Sound is, yes, it's valid, and the premises were true, which means the conclusion is true. So it's easy to show that an argument is valid, and then the hard part is showing that it's sound, generally speaking. So I got those backwards. I don't think for the sake of the context when I was discussing it, it affects the point I was making, but I did get them backwards. So thought that was a fair thing to point out. In our first class, we went through the cosmological argument, which is a proof that there is a God. And this is a proof that is valid and that we showcased is very sound. So it's effectively a knockdown proof where most of the opposition has just stopped trying to oppose it. Not on the popular level, but on the academic level. And then last week, we talked about how the Bible is trustworthy from a historian's perspective and how a historian would say that it is a historically reliable document and how we can use that. And we did not make the argument or the case that it is like divine or that it is the Word of God or that it's sacred religious text. We just said it's a historically reliable document. And so today we're going to answer the last of the three questions we need to answer to be able to say that Christianity is more reasonably true than not. Which the three questions as I pose them are that is there a God? Is the Bible trustworthy in what it says about Jesus? And did Jesus rise from the dead? And if we can say yes to those three questions, then what follows from that is a very sound case for Jesus being God. So today we're going to talk about if Jesus rose from the dead or not. And the specific way we're going to approach this is what's known as a minimal facts argument. This was popularized by Dr. Gary Habermas, who I believe is the world's leading expert on the resurrection. He's a historian. He's spent his career putting in a tremendous amount of work to discern the details around the resurrection and his books. He's currently publishing his magnus opus. I don't know if I said that right, but his full collection of work. And he's got, I think the plan is 3 volumes, and each volume is like 800 to 1,000 pages. But it's a minimal facts argument. It's not the only argument to prove the resurrection. I would actually argue there's a stronger case for the resurrection, that it doesn't rely on the minimal facts, but relies on the maximal facts. I think the maximal facts argument is incredibly robust, but for the sake of time and clarity, the minimal facts argument is much easier to communicate. So, did Jesus rise from the dead? I'm going to make an absurd claim. The Christian faith lives and dies on a single statement, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not the first person to make that claim, though. In 1 Corinthians, Paul made that claim. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope, in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. The Christian faith lives and dies on the single claim, Jesus actually rose from the dead. So, how do you go about proving such a claim? How do you even start to try to show that that's a reasonable statement? I mean, on its surface, the sentiment's absurd. The idea that somebody was dead and then rose from the dead is an absurd statement. I mean, that's why we call it a miracle. And that's why it's such a big deal in Christianity, because people don't actually rise from the dead. And if they did, it wouldn't matter to say someone did. Right? It is quite an absurd claim. So how do we investigate a claim of a miracle? Well, when we talked about the proof for the existence of God in the cosmological argument, we did what's known as deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is where the conclusions follow by logical necessity from the premises. Just how logical arguments are structured. We're actually going to instead, because you can only do that with logic, instead of deductive reasoning, today we're going to be using abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning is following the evidence to its most reasonable conclusion. This is what detectives do. So detective will, hello. So a detective will look at a crime scene. Let me give a very simple example. If you walk into a room and you see that there's papers all about the room everywhere and the window's open, you might conclude that there was a large gust of wind that came through. And that would be abductive reasoning. It's an argument to the best or most reasonable explanation. Now, that is most likely true. It's also possible that a bird flew in there and then flew out. Right? It's also possible that somebody threw the papers and then opened the window to try to set up a scene. So abductive reasoning doesn't give you like logical necessity. It doesn't give you, I know for certain this occurred. It gives you, this is more reasonable than the alternatives. And so that's the degree to which we can say Jesus Christ rose from the dead, is if we can simply say it's more reasonable than the alternatives. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And so even talking about that, I'm talking about how we're examining the evidence. So what evidence is there for the resurrection? Dr. Habermas, who I mentioned earlier, has came to 12 distinct facts around the crucifixion that most historians, regardless of their personal beliefs, agree are historically sound. Now, these 12 facts, 11 of them, there is more than a 95% consensus across critical scholarship. Critical scholarship is defined as people who study the historicity of the scriptures who aren't Christians. So 95% of critical scholars, and I think his study actually does include non-critical scholars, to be fair, but 95% of scholars agree on 11 of these facts, and then one of the facts has about a 75% consensus. We are going to be making a minimal facts claim, and so we don't need all 12 of those facts. Actually, we can make our case on 6. So the 6 facts that we're going to be defending, that all critical scholar, or the majority of critical scholar believes are historical facts, include the crucifixion. Jesus Christ was crucified under Roman rule by Pontius Pilate. This is actually the most attested event of antiquity. We have more certainty that Jesus Christ was crucified than we have that Julius Caesar lived. There's basically a unanimous consensus that Jesus Christ is a man who was crucified. Second is appearances. So very specifically, the way that all critical scholarship agrees on this, majority of critical scholarship, I gotta be better with my language there. The way that majority of critical scholarship agrees on this isn't that Christ appeared to people, it's that Christ's followers had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Christ. So it's the disciples immediately had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Specifically in the New Testament, which we showed last week as a historically reliable document, we get 12 total appearances that have been documented about Christ's appearance after his crucifixion. These appearances are listed. I can send you the list because I don't have it on the slides. But most of these appearances, 9 out of the 12, were group appearances. 3 of the 12 were individual appearances. Third is that the disciples were martyred. Now, critical scholarship doesn't agree on the unanimity of the martyrdom. So the church tradition is that 11 of the apostles were martyred. 1 was sentenced to death, lived through it, and then sent to Patmos, an island prison, for the rest of his life. The critical scholarship doesn't necessarily agree that all of them were martyred, because some of the church tradition isn't very reliable from a historian's perspective. But what they do agree is that they were persecuted, and many of them were martyred. So martyrdom of the disciples. Disciples were tortured, martyred, killed for their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And many of them very explicitly for the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. One that most scholarship agrees on is the martyrdom of Andrew, in which Andrew was told he would be cut down from his cross if he denied Christ. And so that's a pretty solid, he was killed for the claim that Christ was risen. Fourth fact is that James converted. So James is a well-known brother of Jesus Christ who was a skeptic, who was adamant that his brother was not God until after his brother was crucified. And then James became a pillar of the early church. And how does that work? So that's one that we need to account for. Fifth one is Saul's conversion. Saul was not someone who ever met Jesus, but who was in a position of power and authority and was given the job of destroying the Christian movement by the Pharisees, the Jewish sect that he was a part of. And then during this job, he became an adamant Christian. And Saul wrote enough after his name was changed to Paul that pretty much everyone agrees that he certainly was converted to being a Christian. And then the sixth one, this is actually the one that's only about 75% consensus, is that the tomb was empty. That the tomb where Christ was buried is empty. I'm not sure as to why it's a weaker claim, why less historians believe it, but it's still the case that the overwhelming majority, like this is more than a 2/3 vote. This stops a veto, right? Like 75% of critical historians believe that the tomb was empty. So those are the facts that we are going to attempt to explain. And since we're going to be doing abductive reasoning, the best explanation to the facts will be the one that we accept. So the goal is that we would come up with a theory on what happened that satisfies all of the facts that we know occurred. And if we can say, yes, this theory checks out that fact, then it's a stronger theory. And so we want a theory that checks off all 6 boxes. So what we're going to do once we've found our theories that check off all the boxes is we're going to apply something known as Occam's razor. Occam's razor strictly states entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. But what that means is that when you have multiple explanations for an event, the simplest explanation is favorable. So what we're going to do today is, step 1, we are going to identify all of the posted theories that satisfy the minimal facts. Step 2 is we're going to apply Occam's razor to conclude which is the simplest. And then step 3 is we will then use that and we will declare a winner. And that will be the hypothesis that someone who's being intellectually honest will accept as more reasonably true than the others. So let's go through the historical theories. The first one, the wrong tomb theory. The wrong tomb theory is the simplest of all of the proposed theories. Its strength is probably that it's easy to explain. The wrong tomb theory is simple. The disciples, the women, went to the wrong tomb. So how does it stack up on the facts? Well, the wrong tomb theory, does it explain the crucifixion? Well, yes. The theory assumes that Christ was killed. So yes. Does it explain the appearances? Well, given that the theory itself is completely silent on the appearances, I would argue probably not. It's silent on the theory. Oops. Does it explain the martyrdom? Well, if they simply went to the wrong tomb, I think it's conceivable that they would have had a weak confidence that Christ might have been risen from the dead, especially if you add to it the fact that they tell us they were told he would rise from the dead. So you can get a weak claim that, yeah, they would believe that possibly he did rise from the dead. And maybe then they'd even start telling people that he rose from the dead. And then, when people started torturing them and killing them and persecuting them for the claim that Christ rose from the dead, I suspect at least some of them would have said, actually, I don't know that, the tomb was just empty. But since none of them recanted, I'd say that this doesn't really explain the martyrdom. It also isn't a good explanation of why James or Saul converted. If James spent his entire life seeing his brother, and then later in life seeing his brother's ministry, and wasn't convinced that he was God, why would not seeing his brother convince him that he's God? Why would, he saw him die, and then it's like, okay. And then he hears that, people went to the tomb. I don't think it's a strong argument for his conversion. And Saul's is even weaker because it doesn't even speak to Saul's conversion. Because he tells us his experience and he never met Christ, before the crucifixion, I don't think that it's a good explanation of Saul's conversion. Now, here's the crazy one, though. Is it a good explanation of the empty tomb? That's its primary point, is to try to be an explanation of the empty tomb. But in Matthew 27, we learn that Joseph of Arimathea knew where the tomb was, that Pontius Pilate knew where the tomb was, that Mary knew where the tomb was. We know that it was public knowledge where the tomb is, which is a big deal, because if someone starts saying Jesus rose from the dead, and they had just went to the wrong tomb, since the right tomb is public knowledge, I would believe the first thing that people who disagreed with them would do is go check the tomb. And then what we would hear is the hilarious story of how these people thought that their Messiah had risen from the dead because they went to the wrong tomb. And then this would be a footnote in a history book somewhere, rather than the religion of Christianity.
Didn't Peter also go check once he found out that the women were saying he...
John and Peter.
John and Peter.
Yep.
So they also most likely knew where the tomb was.
Yeah. So the theory is trying to argue that morning they went to the wrong tomb. And yeah, like there's already some ad hocness in that two separate groups went to the wrong tomb, independent of each other. When you add to it that the correct tomb is public knowledge, that they are going against the most powerful groups of the time who would easily go check it, you realize that the wrong tomb theory actually doesn't even explain the detail it's trying to explain. It becomes so ad hoc that it's unreasonable. Ad hoc is when you add complexity that requires more beliefs. It's kind of what ad hoc's a very hard term to define philosophically, but like I've yet to find a definition of ad hoc. Like philosophers just use it because they understand it conceptually.
So is that just like the opposite of the definition you just gave about razor?
In a sense, yeah. So when you're applying Occam's razor, you ask how much ad hocness is in this theory. Like how many things does it require me to believe? So, like when we get to it, the resurrection theory has an element of ad hocness because it requires you to believe that miracles exist. That's not ad hocness if you already believe in God, but it is ad hocness if you don't. So it's just, what is it requiring you to believe in addition to the theory's statement? That's probably the best way that I could explain it. What are you being asked to believe in addition to what's being stated? So the wrong tomb theory, I used it first because it is the weakest theory. It checks off one of the 6. So what about the stolen body theory? This is a fun one. This is actually, I wonder if I wrote this. Let's see what I wrote. So proponents of the stolen body theory suggest that Christ's disciples actually stole his body. This is the oldest proposed alternative to the resurrection because it actually dates prior the resurrection, possibly prior to the crucifixion. So the next day, this is Matthew 27 as well. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. The last deception will be worse than the first." So this theory predates the resurrection. The theory predates 5 of our 6 facts, but it still has to be able to explain those facts. So let's see, how does this theory stack up? How does the stolen body theory stack up? Does it explain the crucifixion? Yes. You can't steal a body unless there's a body. So it certainly relies on Christ's crucifixion. Does it explain the appearances? I'm going to say yes. Because if they stole the body to be able to argue that he rose from the dead, now it's a conspiracy theory. This is it's also known as the conspiracy theory. Then it makes sense that they would make up appearances to defend that he rose from the dead. So yes, it explains the appearances. Does it explain the martyrdom? What we know about people is that human beings will die for lies when they believe they're true. But they will not die for lies when they know they're lies. And the disciples were in a unique position that no one other than the disciples has ever been in human history. They know whether or not they saw Christ. People don't die for lies. So I would say no, it does not explain the martyrdom very well. It also is completely silent on both James and Paul's conversions. And it does tell us why the tomb's empty. So it gets 3 of the 6 boxes. Tomb's empty because they took the body. He died. They lied about the appearances, but it doesn't explain why they were willing to be tortured, why they were willing to be killed. It doesn't explain why James or Paul became Christians. So 3 out of 6. Okay, twin theory. There's actually 2 versions of the twin theory. So the twin theory hypothesis is, in discussion of twin theory, we're going to look at both versions. The first version of the twin theory is that Jesus did not die on the cross, but in fact, somebody else was crucified in his place. We'll call that twin theory A. Someone and it isn't literally twin theory necessarily, like it's not like he had to be a twin, it's that he had someone die for him. The second theory is similar, but it contends that after Jesus' death on the cross, so Jesus actually does die, an imposter appeared to his disciples claiming to be Jesus. We're going to call that twin theory B. So, twin theory A, that somebody else died on the cross. Does this explain the crucifixion? Yeah. Someone died on the cross. Now, notice I put an asterisk on this one. An asterisk is my pointing out, I believe that this is tremendously ad hoc. I think this is a really hard stretch. But the reason that I'm saying yes is because I accept the reality that someone who isn't persuaded that God exists thinks the resurrection is really ad hoc. So I'm trying to be just as accepting of all possible views as it seems like one would be of the resurrection. And so why do I think this is so ad hoc? Because we're told that Jesus' mother and John, the disciple, were there at his crucifixion, close enough for him to talk to them. So you're telling me that Jesus' mother doesn't recognize that's not him? Like, that's a stretch. That's really hard to accept conceptually. So I think the imposter idea here is very, very improbable. Also, the theory when it's proposed, sometimes people do propose a literal twin. The issue with the literal twin, rather than just like a representative, is that now you're relying on this idea that the entire family was keeping the fact that they had twins a secret for 33 years. And in the middle of the family not believing anything about the ministry, but yet knowing that like they were going to rely on the twin element to perpetuate the ministry, I think the family would have been very vocal about the twins. Like, that's not Jesus, that's actually his twin. But I would say, for the sake of argument, let's say yes, it does explain the crucifixion. Does it explain the appearances? Well, I'm going to skip ahead. I know this isn't great for presentation, but I don't remember if I did A, then B, or if I did A and B. Okay, I did A, then B. Sorry. So I don't think it explains the appearances. So, twin theory A, could it explain the appearances? Here's my struggle with it. My struggle with it is that after his resurrection, he appears to them 12 times over 40 days and then disappears forever. So think about the type of individual who spends years trying to convince everyone that he's God and then orchestrates a ruse to showcase that he rose from the dead to prove that he's God and lets an innocent person die to make that case. That person would probably have very particular motives, but they'd also probably have a very particular psychological framing. That person doesn't just disappear and give up on trying to take over Rome. Like, that person doesn't just stop ministering. And if he does disappear from that location, what we know about him is he's incredibly good at winning over crowds. We would have immediately afterwards learned about another Messiah-type figure somewhere else. There's no way that he would have just disappeared from history. So I don't think that it's actually a justifiable explanation of the appearances. I think, frankly, while I think this is plenty ad hoc, I think this is too ad hoc. It's too much of a stretch. You're saying too many things that just aren't believable about the type of person who would have done this. But it does explain the martyrdom, because they literally saw him. One other detail, I guess, about the appearances again is that I skipped over. when he tells the disciples, look at the holes in my wrist and the hole in my side, and put your fingers and hands in it, that suggests that he also mutilated himself to make the case. And those mutilations would probably have killed him. So again, just a ton of ad hoc in there. But it would explain the martyrdom. If they did see him alive and well, because he wasn't the one who died on the cross, that's justifiable. If it's a literal twin, it doesn't really explain why James would have converted. If it's not a literal twin, it still doesn't explain why James would have converted, because James would have interacted with him and be like, "You're not my brother." I'm sorry. That's the issue with twin theory B. I mixed up twin theory A and B for a second. Twin theory A, it doesn't really do a good job explaining the conversions, because if it's the literal twin, James is in on the ruse, right? And it certainly doesn't explain Paul's coming down. Now, I think even while analyzing this, you could make a case. I chose to go against it. I'm not defending that it's a good argument for the conversion of James. If you want to say, yeah, actually, it would make sense to me if James didn't know about the ruse and it wasn't a literal twin, then he saw his brother okay. I'd say you can check off that box. It doesn't really change the fact that it's not a good justification of the appearances of Saul's conversion, or most importantly, there is certainly a body in that tomb now. Someone died on the cross. There's certainly a body in the tomb. Twin theory B, for very similar arguments, I actually give the same checks. However, I give it a better claim to the crucifixion, because twin theory B is that Christ literally died on the cross. I don't think twin theory B can explain appearances, because if you're interacting with Christ close up and it's not Christ, you're gonna know. John, the disciple John, slept on Christ's chest. I think he was close enough to him to know if someone's an imposter. And then again, the biggest problem with both of these, in my opinion, is that they don't explain the empty tomb. They tell us there's certainly a body in that tomb. What about hallucination theory? I think hallucination theory might be the most popular alternative to the resurrection. And from a naturalist perspective, it might be my favorite. Hallucination theory seems robust. So this theory proposes that the disciples simply hallucinated during the instances where they believed to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. So, how does it hold up? Well, the hallucination theory says that Christ was crucified. Oddly enough, so often these theories, these naturalistic theories, fail to explain the detail they're trying to explain. The hallucination theory doesn't explain the appearances, because there's no such thing as group hallucination. We know very well that group hallucination is not a concept. Additionally, if you're hallucinating, you will not be able to feel something. So the fact that we have 9 of the 12 appearances are groups, and repeatedly Christ is saying, feel the hole in my wrist, feel the hole in my side. Christ is touching his disciples. Christ cooked a meal for his disciples. These are outside the scope of what hallucinations can do. So, and to be fair to the hallucination hypothesis, when it was first developed, we didn't know that much about hallucinations. So, over time, it's became weaker. I'm going to read a quote from Dr. Gary Collins on this topic. Hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce an hallucination in somebody else. Since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. So I don't think it actually checks off the appearances, which is what I think it was primarily trying to do. It does, in my opinion, defend the martyrdom. Because when you move on and you accept hallucination as a hypothesis, even though maybe it doesn't make sense for the appearances, you can understand how people have had religious hallucinations that have changed their life and that they've been willing to die for. That's not an unreasonable claim. I'm going to say yes there. Does it explain James's conversion? Well, I'm going to, for the same reason, say yes. Because from James's perspective, he would have seen the risen Christ. Does it explain Paul's conversion? Very well. If you read Paul's own testimony of his experience with Christ, it reads like a hallucination. Like, there are others with him who do not see what he sees. So, yes, for sure. Does it explain the empty tomb? No. If they only had a hallucination of the risen Christ, then they could have went and checked and seen the body was still there. So it does not explain the empty tomb. So, doesn't explain the appearances because we know too much about hallucinations today. Historically, if this argument was being made 100 years ago, we would have checked off all the boxes except the empty tomb. But we know more about how hallucinations work today. Last one before the leading hypothesis that we tend to, as believers, accept is swoon theory. So swoon theory, do you know what swoon theory is? Or were you just laughing at the picture? Yeah. It was a good picture. Yeah. It was hard to find. Like, I spent so long looking for that specific picture because like I know it exists. So swoon theory. Proponents of the swoon theory suggest that Jesus was crucified, but that he didn't actually die while he was on the cross. Rather, he fainted or swooned and was assumed dead. Mark 15:43 through 45 is often cited as circumstantial evidence for this theory. So, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So they're citing the fact that Pilate, who had executed quite a few prisoners under crucifixion, was shocked at how fast Christ died, as evidence that it's reasonable that he might not have died. So they argue that Pilate was surprised because Jesus died too quickly, and suggest that it is more likely that he simply lost consciousness. Sounds plausible. So let's see how it stacks up. All right. So I'm going to say a whole lot more about this one. I'm just going to read a lot from my notes on this one, specifically for the crucifixion. So for the crucifixion, we want to examine the medical and historical context to see if it's possible that he could have just fainted and not died. So, Jesus' suffering began before his arrest. In Luke 22:44, we are told that he sweated blood in Gethsemane, which is a real condition that's called hematidrosis, which is caused by extreme stress when capillaries around your sweat glands actually rupture. And that's how you can end up sweating blood. This indicates that his body was already under severe strain before the crucifixion began. He also then underwent Roman flogging. Roman flogging, he would have been sentenced to 39 lashes, 40 less 1. And the reason for that is that 40 lashes is a form of a death penalty. 40 lashes is considered a death penalty. It's death by flogging. 39 is just a punishment, because Pontius Pilate was trying to punish him, not kill him, and he was trying to appease the mob. So he was sentenced to flogging. Now, that being said, we have a historical artifact called the Shroud of Turin that many people believe is the burial shroud of Christ. If it is, it's the burial shroud of somebody, and that person was whipped 153 times. So, while he was sentenced to 39 lashes, if that's Christ, and I personally believe it more likely is Christ than anything else, then his torturers got carried away. So that would have been more than 3 times a death penalty in and of itself. Victims frequently died from blood loss during this, or dehydration, or even shock. And then the crucifixion itself, crucifixion kills by asphyxiation. So I often get this wrong, so I wrote it down to make sure I don't get it wrong. The way that the being crucified positions your body, in order to exhale, you have to lift your body up. In order to inhale, you have to let your body drop. And so you're pulling yourself up to exhale, letting yourself down to inhale, and you're doing that until you're too exhausted to pull yourself up, and then you suffocate to death. That's how crucifixion kills somebody. Now, finally, John 19 tells us that Jesus was stabbed by a spear, because this is a big deal too about just the idea of the swoon theory. If an executioner in Roman's civilization failed to execute, their sentence for that was the same execution. So the Roman executioners, if they took him off the cross and he was still breathing, they would be crucified. This is why, when he died soon, they chose to stab him to make sure he was dead. So they stabbed him with a spear. And a very important detail here that John reports, that John would have witnessed and not understood, is that in John 19:34, we learn that clear fluid and blood came out. He says water and blood. He doesn't say clear fluid. He says water and blood because that's what it looked like. Well, we now know that clear fluid that he called water is precardial and I don't know how to say the second one. Pleural effusion. These are fluids that form around the heart and lungs when one has died from asphyxiation. They do not form around the heart and lungs from other deaths. And they do not form around the heart and lungs until you're dead. So this tells us the spear wound pierced the heart and lung, and he was dead before they did that. So good job, John, reporting something you saw and didn't understand, but helps us now. So this is why in the Journal of the American Medical Association, back in 1986 on this topic, doctors William D. Edwards, Wesley Gable, and Floyd Hosmer wrote, "The weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Interpretations assuming he survived are at odds with modern medical knowledge." So, in short, Jesus couldn't have swooned. He was dead before he was stabbed. The wound that he received was a fatal wound on its own. So, the biblical, historical, and medical evidence tells us there was no way he could have survived it. But if you're interested in learning more about that particularly, Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, he interviewed Dr. Alexander Metherell, and in my opinion, it's the most detailed yet accessible report on this topic. I think that he did a very good job of explaining it very thoroughly and very easy to read. So, swoon theory does not explain the crucifixion. The thing it's trying to defend is the thing it fails at. Does it explain the martyrdom of the disciples? Well, if Jesus did survive such a thing, if we were to say, okay, he actually somehow swooned, then what we would see is a man who was so beaten, bloodied, wounded, that when you saw him, you wouldn't want to worship him, you'd want to pity him and get him to a hospital. If he told you that this is what it looks like to conquer death, you'd say, no, I'll stay dead. And before he could have appeared to them, in this weakened, broken state, he would have had to somehow move the stone from his tomb. The stones that go in front of tombs weigh several tons and are intentionally placed downhill. They're wedged into the door. This is why the women, when they wanted to go put incense on him, were concerned about how will we move the tomb, or how will we move the stone, who will get to move the stone, because one person can't do it. It takes a lot of people to move a stone on a tomb. Christ certainly could not have done it if he was just a man in that state.
He hired someone to move that for him.
Maybe.
But not the disciples, because then they would have been on the lie and then they wouldn't have been martyred for it. Right? So I'd say it doesn't explain the appearances. Again, there's just too much ad hocness there. You wouldn't worship a man in that shape. I'd say it doesn't explain the martyrdom for the same exact reason. Even if they did nurse him back to health, that's not the type of resurrection I think many people would be willing to die for. I think what they would have learned there is, and what they might have concluded, being that they were like Jewish men in first century, they might have concluded that he's of Satan. Like, there's something evil here. Like, and I don't want it, because look at what happens when you accept it. And I don't think it's a good explanation of the martyrdom. I think it's a terrible explanation of James's conversion. The shape that Christ is in, I don't think would be compelling to someone who witnessed miracles and wasn't convinced. And so I have a tough time with that one. Doesn't address Paul's conversion, but it does explain the empty tomb. Again, I'm trying to be as liberal as possible with this, right? Like, yeah, you can say that we definitely saw him alive, and somehow if he got out of the tomb, we can. But I think those are the only checkboxes we can even pretend to give it. I think everything else is just unsubstantiated bull. Yes. Swoon theory for a long time has been the most popular, like, alternative theory. I think hallucination theory is a much better alternative theory. But I think the best theory is probably the resurrection theory. Hey, I have a typo. I think the resurrection theory is probably the best theory. So you might recall earlier I described that the stolen body theory was the oldest proposed alternative to the resurrection. I pointed out that it was proposed prior to the resurrection. But the resurrection theory is actually the oldest theory. Because Christ told them he was going to rise from the dead before he was crucified. So it wins. It's the oldest theory to explain everything. When we allow for theories that predate the crucifixion, the resurrection theory is actually the oldest of all the proposed theories. Recorded in John 2, the resurrection theory is presented when Jesus tells the Jews that he will rise from the dead roughly 3 years prior to his actual crucifixion. This predates the crucifixion by 3 years. So how does it hold up? If the resurrection theory was valid, would it explain that Christ died on the cross? Yes, it would necessitate that he died on the cross. Would it explain the appearances? Well, according to the resurrection theory, Jesus rose from the dead 3 days after his crucifixion. And then he went on to appear to multiple people, mostly in groups, throughout the course of 40 days, and then he ascended into heaven. If he rose from the dead and was in the glorified state, yeah, that's exactly why the disciples thought that he appeared to them. Would it explain the martyrdom of the disciples? I followed a rabbi who told me he was God, that he would prove it by rising from the dead, and then he rose from the dead in a restored state and told me to proclaim that he's God. Pretty good argument for being willing to die for that. Does it explain James's conversion? Well, he spends his entire life convinced his brother isn't God, sees his brother die, and then sees his brother resurrected. Might be quite compelling. I don't know what else would get me to believe that my sibling is God, but this is a pretty good step in the right direction, I would say. Does this explain Saul's conversion? I will say yes, and I will admit that this one is slightly ad hoc, comparatively, because if Jesus rose from the dead, then it means that everything he said about himself is true, including that he is God, and God has the ability to appear to somebody in a non-physical form. So there's a little bit of ad hocness in it, but I would say it does actually explain Saul's conversion. He saw the risen Christ. Does it explain the empty tomb? Yeah, Christians celebrate that one. So I told you that what we were going to do is look at all of the proposed theories throughout history. We were going to see which ones satisfy the minimal facts, and then we would apply Occam's razor to discerning which of those is most likely valid. Here's how all the theories stack up. You can see that there's only one theory that actually checked all the boxes. So we don't actually have to apply Occam's razor. My button just stopped working. Come on. I have another slide. I had another slide. It got deleted. That's lame. I had another slide. I was proud of it. I'll just read what it said. No, I won't, because I deleted that because I was so ready for it. It's kind of a letdown. I was going to quote Sherlock Holmes to you guys. Sherlock Holmes said, "Once we have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true." And that's exactly what we've done. We've eliminated all of the theories that are impossible, leaving one that is incredibly improbable. But since it is the only one that's possible, it must be true. Dr. Gary Habermas. So what I would say is that unfortunately for the skeptic, it turns out that outside of the resurrection theory, there is no theory which is even capable, in theory, of explaining the minimal facts surrounding Jesus' crucifixion. This is why Dr. Gary Habermas has said that the critics have generally given up espousing these theories. What I got? Any questions? comments? Any thoughts?
I'll give thoughts. I think I found it shocking that there's much more argument, and I think desire to make the swoon theory true versus the hallucination theory. I just feel like the hallucination, based on what I'm looking at, when you have to explain it, it's a lot stronger than the swoon.
I think the hallucination theory is a strong theory. I think swoon theory seems more mechanical in a way. Like, it seems like, so most people who kind of accept one of these theories do it without thinking very critically about it, right? And you can understand how in a casual conversation, like, well, what if he just didn't die on the cross, though? You know, like it just seems like it would, without critical thought, it seems like it would kind of explain everything. But when you really look into it, yeah, I think hallucination theory is a much stronger theory. I think and Bart Ehrman is a pretty famous atheistic historian who actually affirms all of these minimal facts. And then when asked why he doesn't affirm the resurrection, he says historians can't speak on the resurrection because it's a miracle and that's outside the scope of a historian's job. I think he's wrong, but that's like, he doesn't actually give an argument. But when he's pressed, well, what is an alternative theory that you would accept as a historian? His alternative is the hallucination theory. And I think if I was in a similar boat, if I was a atheist, I would probably lean on the hallucination theory as most probable. But this is another one. You could bring this up. The hallucination theory doesn't check all the boxes, but it checks all the boxes except for two. And the stolen body theory checks the two boxes that hallucination theory doesn't. So could you combine the theory? Could you say that they experienced hallucinations and there was a stolen body? Those two theories are not compatible with each other. They stole the body, then they didn't hallucinate the risen Christ. They were a conspiracy, right? And so, well, could they have had hallucinations and Christ swoon? Could those match? This is something that some people do try to do, is they try to figure out which multiple materialistic hypotheses can work in unison. And to that, and I've spoke to this in my book, but to that, you can get the benefits of multiple theories, but you also get all of their drawbacks. So now you have more, you've multiplied your problems, and you've multiplied your ad hocness. This is why, generally speaking, there's pretty much no one, like in academic debates, who actually does try to put multiple theories together. But hallucination with swoon theory might work. If Christ, like, didn't actually die, and that's how he got out of the tomb, then he could have appeared to people. Other people could have had hallucinations. They can kind of merge. You just get the problems of both theories. You'd get, well, the people who did see Christ wouldn't have wanted to worship him. You'd get, how on earth did Christ get out of the tomb? You get the problem. There's still no such thing as mass hallucinations.
That's actually, I didn't know that. That people like to, it seems like they like to combine theories.
I wouldn't say academics do, but it's exercises that have been tried. And you can see that, like, there's this natural desire to not want to follow the Lord. And so when you are leaning into that desire, even subconsciously, you can see how you would say any other explanation is a better one, right? So you could say, yeah, some of the disciples were in a conspiracy theory. Some of the disciples had hallucinations. Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. You could see how you just, like, weave a web to try to avoid the truth. I wouldn't say academically it happens very often, but most of the people we're going to be interacting with aren't the academics who study this stuff, right?
Yeah. My other question, and I think it's my last question too, can you explain what minimalist facts versus maximal facts?
Yeah. So minimal facts is just asking the question, what are the fewest facts that historians agree on that eliminate all alternatives to the resurrection? And so you could say, well, wouldn't it have been a more minimal fact argument if I had removed the appearances and Paul's conversion, like, couldn't I have removed some and like there's still no other, like, but that's what the minimal facts argument is what are the fewest facts we need to discuss to point out that no alternative works. I land on 6. I kind of like the 6, but that's kind of what the exercise is. The maximal facts argument is, I would say it's twofold the way it's usually presented. It is, instead of what are the fewest facts, it's what are all the facts that historians agree upon, generally speaking. And I think Habermas has a list of roughly 72 facts surrounding the resurrection. But then also, generally speaking, when someone presents a maximal fact argument, they don't rely on the fact that historians agree. They actually go through why historians agree on each of these facts. What's the evidence for it? And to be fair, a couple years ago when I was at an apologetics conference where Habermas was supposed to speak, I planned on going to his talk because I wanted to ask him one question about the minimal facts argument. I didn't care about his talk. I was just going to ask him that during the Q&A. He ended up actually having to have emergency surgery, and so he didn't make it. But what I was going to ask him was that the minimal facts argument as presented has an epistemic problem. Epistemology is how we know what we know. And the epistemic stance of we're relying on experts without knowing why experts believe that is a very weak epistemic frame. So I just wanted to call him out on it. Now, and then see how he responded. Now, I'll give you a response on why I still present it as a good argument. The reason that I'm still perfectly happy to use it is, one, it's not like we're making the fallacy of appeal to authority. Because the fallacy of appeal to authority is when you appeal to an expert outside of their domain. When you're appealing to an expert inside their domain, it's not a fallacious appeal to authority, it's a proper appeal to authority. Additionally, we're not appealing to an expert. We're appealing to the entire body. And so we're saying this is what the cumulative conclusion has been. And then as a presentation, most of the time you see a minimal facts argument presented because, one, we don't have to go through the work of defending all of our facts, which takes forever. And two, we don't have to go through the work of 72 facts, which also takes forever. It makes for a much easier presentation. It's more digestible. People can wrap their heads around it better. I think if you really wanted to have the best ironclad argument you could for the resurrection, you wouldn't just say, these are the facts that everyone agrees upon. You would say, I believe these facts are true and here's why. And you would do the work of that the historians have done.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a good friend who's an apologist and absolutely hates the minimal facts argument for that epistemic reason. He's like, you shouldn't do it. You should always just prove every fact first. I'm like, fair. I mean, assuming you have the attention span of 3 hours. I think he's right from a academic perspective, but I don't know that he's right from an evangelistic perspective.
Yeah.
Cool. That's what I got for you guys. If you've thought up over the last week of anything else you'd like to talk about in the class in the future, write on the whiteboard before you leave. Next week, the plan right now, unless somebody wants us to discuss something else, is we're going to talk about the problem of evil, which is how does an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God allow evil to exist? Which is one of the questions that was written on the whiteboard. So, what's the plan? Yes, sir.
How do I want to ask this? I should have thought of this more. What I'm trying to ask is something to the effect of, does secondary, primary kind of theological frameworks and arguments for how, for example, Romans and all that's talked about, is that going to influence how that's taught, the problem of evil?
Yeah, so right now, Alvin Plantinga wrote a book, God, Freedom, and Evil. It's the name of the book. I can't find it in my library. My friend Alex bought it for me for Christmas one year, but I can't find it in my library right now, and I'm pretty upset about it. Anyway, Alvin Plantinga disproved the problem of evil in the 20th century, I think in the 1970s, which was incredible because the problem of evil is older than Christianity, and it is the best argument against theism to ever exist. And for it to just be proven as logically flawed, super powerful. And the way he did that is like actually the fully robust format is a logical proof, and the way that you would simplify it and discuss it and and what it's turned into 40 years later is it's known as the free will defense. The free will defense, effectively, to really truncate it, is God likes that we have free will, and therefore we have the capacity for evil. Therefore, evil exists, and free will is the logical form. Is that if we allow for free will, then it's not logically incoherent for God to be loving and allow evil. It's basically what he proves. It doesn't. It's not an issue even remotely with any primary theological beliefs. I can't imagine, though I would need to think about this a lot more, how it would run into issues with any secondary theological beliefs. However, it is certainly the case that there are theological frameworks that, while they aren't, I don't think they're technically incompatible with it. I think there are theological frameworks, there are proponents of theological frameworks who would say it's incompatible. So I think the free will defense, there are people who are Calvinists who will argue that it's incompatible. But I wouldn't say that the actual tenets of Calvinism are incompatible. I would say that's a misreading, and I would say that individual is wrong. This is particularly when you get not just 5-point Calvinists, but 5 points extremists who will argue that human beings don't have free will. And you get that, and it's well, if you don't think that we have free will, then the free will defense definitely doesn't work. But I don't think the framework inherently is incompatible with it.
Yeah. I think I know your answer, but it's going to help and allow me to ask the second question.
Yeah.
What's your definition of free will?
Libertarian free will. So libertarian freedom is the philosophical, this is a philosophical term. But what it means is basically that if I choose to raise my hand, I chose to raise my hand and I raised my hand. And that's the kind of the best definition of it's that I'm actually operating autonomously.
Okay, that's helpful. Just because my second question was going to be, maybe not a question, just kind of a comment. I want to know your thoughts, but I could imagine, and I think I just know a lot of men in our church. I don't know about the women, but I know a lot of men in our church that are very hard-pressed Calvinist, where they had mentioned several times to me, I don't believe in free will at all. And so I can imagine that being a good conversation for next week.
I think God believes in free will. That's what the scriptures tell us. I don't think you give 613 commandments if people have the ability to choose whether or not to obey them. If I don't have the ability to choose, why would he give the commandment? I think every single commandment in the entire Bible is proof that God believes in free will.
Yeah. And maybe it's my job to ask them what they mean by free will.
Yeah.
Because that might be helpful for them
Yeah.
in next week's class to get on the same page or find common ground on what that's actually implying. So, hope I'm alive next week to be in the class.
Cool. Cool.
Yay.
Things are coming.
Yay, audience of 2.